we're going to start talking about the bureaucracy, which is still technically part of the governor's office, right? And we'll spend the next 3 lectures or so on talking about the biggest part of Texas government here, right? The one that has the most employees in it, and I would argue fills a very critical part of this whole democratic process. So the bureaucracy is that part of the state government, operates underneath the executive branch, in other words, underneath the governor on a day-to-day basis, but is created by the Texas legislature, right? They pass laws that create the bureaucratic offices, the agencies, the boards, and the commissions. And their job, right, the executive branch here, what some people call the fourth branch of government, right, the bureaucracy, their job is to implement the law, right? Their job is to take what the legislature has passed and the governor has signed and make it happen. And make it happen in the way that the law is written, and make it happen under the budget that has been given to them, right, to make it happen with. So sometimes that's a decent budget, sometimes it's not much, sometimes it's actually zero. But the fact is that the boards, the agencies, the commissions, right, their job is to turn legislation, turn representation, turn the exercise of democracy into action, right? To implement the laws that have been put into place. So this is where government actually does the work, right? And that's why it's the largest part of government, right? It has the most people in it. In Texas, we have a convoluted process of how we create these, how we design and implement and create these bureaucracies. In most places, the bureaucracy as a whole, all of the boards and agencies, are answering directly to the governor on a day-to-day basis. The governor is the CEO of the state, and they're the employees essentially that work for the governor. And Texas does mostly that. But we also, if you remember back to our Constitution in 1876, when we wrote that, we stripped a lot of powers away from the governor, and we put them in a different place. And this is where we're going to see where that happened and what that different place was. So in that Constitution, we identified several agencies that were very important in 1876, and thought that those agencies might do a better job of representing the state as a whole if they were out from under the control of the governor. So we have several state agencies who their executives, their leadership is actually elected by us, and they run their own agency, and they do not answer to the governor. And in most states, and in Texas prior to 1876, these agencies we're about to talk about would have answered, right, the people running them would have answered to the governor. That would have been their ultimate boss. But when we shrunk the power of the office of governor, we did some of that by taking these offices outside of the governor's office and standing them up on their own. So some of the elected state offices that we have here, right, the Attorney General's office. So the Attorney General of the state of Texas, elected by the whole state of Texas. The Comptroller, right, who's in charge of right, in setting up the budget and setting up the estimate for the budget. um, right, elected by the state as a whole. Land commissioners determining how to use the public lands of Texas to make a profit, elected by the state as a whole. Agricultural commissioner, right, in charge of the Department of Agriculture, elected by the state as a whole. So, you're looking at Attorney General, right, the lawyers for the state of Texas, comptroller, the accountant, and the tax assessor for the state of Texas, and then the land commissioner and the ag commissioner, right, two groups that are, right, having control over the lands of Texas. All of those, right, brought outside of the governor's power and made to stand on their own and elected by us, the people. This is where that weird cooperation between libertarians and populists developed this way of bringing government closer to the people while at the same time, right, strengthening the power of the governor's office as a whole. So we've got this hybrid system where we've got these certain agencies that stand outside the office, but then the bulk of the state agencies, their administrators, their daily leadership is appointed by the governor, right? And so the governor does have the authority over them and controls the message and the general demeanor of the agency and where it's going on a general basis. So we have these elected state officials where we the population, the voters choose them, and then they run their agency. We also have a few agencies where they are boards or commissions, meaning there's not one person running them, but several, and we elect them, right? And so we'll talk briefly about two of them, a Railroad Commission and then the State Board of Education, right? So the Railroad Commission, misnamed, well, it's not misnamed. It was appropriately named when it was created. It is not, the name does not work for it today. When the Railroad Commission was created, it was to regulate railroads in Texas. And it was necessary because the railroads were privately owned companies or privately owned enterprises by, the robber barons basically back in the early 1800s. And, they were, you owned a railroad, you had paid for and built and that infrastructure mainly on your own out of your money. And then you had a monopoly, all right, over what that railroad could do because no one else is going to build a railroad right next to your railroad, right? It costs too much and you don't want that kind of direct competition. So essentially the railroads were being built across the U.S. as monopolies. And in Texas, we weren't happy about that, especially the farmers in Texas who were getting gouged to get their crops to market. And so the agency created the railroad commissioners, again, at the time, right, appointed, but now elected. So this board, this commission, right, today is in charge of regulating the oil and gas industry in Texas. And the reason that happened is that the railroads eventually became regulated at the federal level, right? There was a whole, mishmash of regulatory issues that were affecting railroads across the states, between the states, and federal government said, okay, look, we're going to manage this. We're going to regulate the railroads. They're going to have one set of regulations that they have to follow across the United States, and states are getting out of that business. When that happened, instead of abolishing the Railroad Commission, we had oil and gas industry needing regulation in Texas, needing oversight by an agency, and so the Railroad Commission moved over there and started regulating oil and gas. And they didn't change the name, right? There was a time where they were kind of doing both. And it just historically stuck, and we have never gotten around to changing the Railroad Commission to be the Texas Commission on Oil and Gas. It does, we look at it every legislative session or so, and somebody will propose, let's rename that so that it makes sense. And then they look at the cost and the time and the effort. They go, okay, we all know what it means, so don't bother. And so we still have the Texas Railroad Commission. And the Texas Railroad Commission, those commissioners, the three of them that run that, are elected, statewide. So this is, all right, as opposed to those ones that I just mentioned, like the Attorney General's office, where one person is elected to run a state agency. Here you have commissioners, and all the commissioners are elected to run that agency. So the folks that run for that are folks that want to be regulating one of the most important economic interests of the state of Texas, and that's the oil and gas industry. Now, you'll see here at the very bottom of this, I say this agency is perceived as a captured agency. So let me explain what that means. When you call an agency a captured agency, what that means is you're saying that that agency is captured or controlled by the interest that it's supposed to be regulating. So if the Railroad Commission is considered a captured agency, that means that the oil and gas industry, if you look at it, seems to be telling the Railroad Commission how to do their job, right? And what regulations they can and can't pass. And that, of course, is backwards, right? The idea of these agencies like this, these regulatory agencies, is to, tell that group what the state is going to let them do and how they're supposed to do their work. And so quite often, right, this when we say something's a captured agency, that's not a title that the agency wants, because it means they're working about things the wrong way. However, it is a result, right, being a captured agency as a result of usually trying to regulate a very, very complex industry. If you are going to pick people to regulate the oil and gas industry, it makes sense that the people you pick have an in-depth understanding of how the oil and gas industry works and what its costs are and how it makes its profit and how it does its work. Because if you put people in those positions that don't have a clue, right, it could be a lot of confusion and consternation. So the technical requirements to be able to do the job of railroad commissioner generally mean that the people that are trained and have the knowledge to do this job come out of the industry, right? They have to almost work in the industry to have the background and knowledge to be a good commissioner. And what that means is that when they get elected to be a railroad commissioner, they've probably got a 15 or 20 year history experience working in the oil and gas industry, understanding how the whole process works. And they bring along, right, all of their network, their contacts, their experience with them. And so when there are proposals to regulate the oil and gas industry, this person or group of persons that have been elected might have a very in-depth understanding of what's going on, and they're trying to do two things here. They're trying to regulate this industry so that it benefits the state of Texas, but they also have to manage this industry so that they don't push it out of business or they push it into a position of losing a lot of money, right? So their job is twofold, right? Regulate the business interest so that it's good for Texas, but don't kill the golden goose, right? And so, right, these commissioners, the ones that are qualified to understand how to do both of these things, are usually pretty tight with the industry that they're going to be regulating. And so it looks like from the outside, and it might be even true, that the decisions they're making are not necessarily always in the best interest of the state, but might be in the best interest of the people they're networking with, they've worked with for 20 or 30 years. And They may make decisions that go against maybe the interest of the state. Now, if they're an elected board or commission, we can fix that by, right, voting them out the next time around. But that's what a captured agency is an agency that the public and especially the media think maybe are working a little too close with the regulated interest and not enough independently of them and looking out for the interest of Texas. So you'll see me refer quite often as we go through some of these. I'll say, and this is maybe one of those captured agencies, right? So the Railroad Commission is one example of an elected commission. 3 of those folks elected statewide. The second one is the State Board of Education. And this isn't, I bring them up because this is a unique organization. First off, the State Board of Education's job is to set educational policy for the Texas Education Agency. So you've got TEA out there who sets training standards and curriculum standards and offers up education and support for school districts and teachers and across the state of Texas. And the State Board of Education is the elected board that manages that agency. Now, the unique thing about this board is that its members are elected from single member districts. So we have divided Texas up into 15 State Board of Education districts. From each one of those geographical districts, one person is elected by the populace to serve on the State Board of Education. And so those 15 people, right, that are elected get together and organize themselves to manage Texas Education Agency. This is a pretty important group, right? I mean, this is the guidance group, the group responsible for telling TEA where we're going and what to focus on and what the marching orders are for that agency for the years that they're in office. And that agency, one of the things that comes out of that are the list of textbooks that are approved for school districts to use in Texas. So if you're ever watching the news and you see that there's the news reporting on a debate within the State Board of Education, it's almost always the State Board of Education, these 15 members, arguing amongst themselves about what, especially science and history textbooks, are going to be approved to be used in public education in the state of Texas. And you'll have, on science textbooks, you'll continually have the debate on whether creationism is a subject that should be in a science textbook and presented as a scientific theory alongside of evolution, and the two be discussed as competing scientific theories about how things are the way they are. And so you'll every time they're talking about textbook adoption, that's one of the fights that we have. Textbooks that are going to be used for health education. Obviously, anytime the health education starts veering close to anything that has to do with reproductive education and sexual identity or gender identity in education, because the state board is going to have a debate about that. And the thing that most of us in Texas aren't paying attention to or don't even really necessarily care about is that once that decision's made, it affects the rest of the country. The State Board of Education in Texas, right, is representing what we're up to 29 million people in Texas. If you figure, 10 to 15% of those folks are in public education at any one time, right, you're talking a huge market for textbooks. And so when states like Texas, California, New York, Florida make decisions about what books they're going to make eligible to be used in Texas classrooms, it impacts all of the other states because these education publication companies, they're not going to go spend a whole lot of time in a state like Wyoming that has 750,000 people in the state and maybe 60,000, 70,000 kids in school. They're not going to ask them, hey, what book do you want? What book can we build for you that you want to use them? Because there's not enough people buying books, education books for those school districts. But in Texas, in California, and Michigan, New York, Florida, when we make decisions about what books are going to be available, that changes the market for textbooks in the United States. And so these 15 people are part of a very influential group of people across those 4 or 5 states in the U.S. that determine which textbooks are actually going to be sold and which ones are going to make a profit. And so they change the market when they make these decisions. We don't pay attention to that. All we pay attention to in Texas, of course, is which books are going to be chosen for our kids to learn from. So based upon where you live, which district you're in, you will be paying attention to one election of people, between people that want to represent your state board of education district. And you'll vote on one of these 15 spots. And then they'll come together and make the decisions for the state as a whole. Again, this is generally, right, in most states, this Board of Education or whatever their similar agency is those people are appointed by the governor. You elect your governor, the governor appoints all of these people, and they run these agencies the way the governor wants to be run. And right, that should square up with how you voted maybe. Here, just like the elected state officials, right, just like the elected state commissioners, state board of education is elected by us. And so that changes the nature of who these people are and what's going on with them. Those two groups, right, of elected officials are, right, all reducing the power of governor in the state of Texas. We talked about that as the plural executive in Texas, right? The rest of the agencies in Texas, the boards, commissions, and agencies, the governor does have the control over them and is appointing people to run these. Some of these agencies, the governor appoints one person, like the Secretary of State's office. Some of them he appoints a board or appoints a commission of multiple people to run those agencies, and we'll talk about each of those. The Secretary of State, very, very, very important bureaucratic agency. It is their job to manage essentially all of the communication from the government to the people of Texas. And that communication is communication of laws that change, right? What statutes are in effect and how they look and what their current language is. When elections are going to be held, how you filed as a candidate to run for election. That's determined through the Secretary of State's office. All of the county clerks that are going to be running those elections have to run them under the regulation and the rules that come from the Secretary of State and the law in Texas. If you're going to incorporate and build a business in Texas, you're going to get your corporate charter from the Secretary of State's office, right? You're going to go and pay a fee, and they're going to incorporate or charter you as a corporation, give you a tax ID for the state, right? So that all goes through there, and then all public notifications are issued out under the authority of the Secretary of State. So anytime the government's state government's putting out a notification, the Secretary of State's going to be responsible for ensuring that communication goes to the right places, is published at the right times, and meets the requirements that need to be published at that time, which could be election notices, could be filing notices for candidates, could be public records of upcoming meetings, or the public records of a past meeting, opportunities for people to engage in public debate and discussion, right? All those get issued from the Secretary of State. So very important position. The governor appoints the person that runs this agency. Another little bit of a different example of the governor's appointments powers is Public Utility Commission. 3 people appointed to run this. Their job is to regulate telephone and electric power and companies in Texas, and you've probably seen them in the news lately, right? Because this is the commission that is responsible for ensuring that the power companies in Texas are online and maintained and doing their job. And obviously, when we had the snows this spring, that didn't happen. And then we originally talked about the Energy Reliability Council of Texas, ERCOT. That's their job their job is mainly to manage the balance of power across the state. But the public utility commissioners are the ones that are the regulatory power over those power companies that are supposed to be making sure they follow a good maintenance schedule and stuff and stay online. They have the ability to regulate what they do. They have the authority to fine those corporations that aren't doing that job. This is where we get the idea of them being quasi-judicial. In other words, they have the ability to go out and investigate and issue penalties and fines, and then have a kind of judiciary setting where they tell a company, come in and we need you to testify for us and tell us what's going on, and we're going to talk to you about the way you're doing your job, and those companies have to respond to that. So they're quasi-judicial in that sense, in that they find the problems, they penalize, they hear the issues, and they penalize the issues. They're also the ones that set the parameters around utility rates in Texas, right? So how much you can be charged for each kilowatt hour of power that you use is determined in Texas by these commissioners. So when these people are being appointed by the governor, you'd like them, right, to be having some interest in what the power costs are going to impact the little people with. Notice here, right, considered to be a captured agency. Again, just like under the Texas Railroad Commission, it makes sense that this would be one of those commissions that's subject to this charge. Most of us don't have a clue about how telephone and power companies work, generate their profit, why they charge what they charge, how they go about doing that. So the people that look good on paper to be appointed as public utility commissioners probably come out of some background of working in public utilities, which means, again, they're subject to being captured by the interests they're supposed to be regulated. Little different take on a commission that's actually appointed by the governor. When I used to work for the Commission on Environmental Quality, right, their job is to regulate businesses that have an adversarial impact on the environment. And so their dual mission is to look after the environment while they regulate the business that have an impact on that environment. And the idea is to balance those out so that Texans have a relatively clean environment, but also don't kill our business environment. And so they're having to do some of that on both ends. A lot of the areas that TCEQ regulates are highly complex areas, and so a lot of the people that work in the agency and regulate from inside the agency have come out of those businesses, again, just like PUC. And so we're quite often charged with being considered a captured agency as well. I should say, most of the business interests that TCQ is regulating um, or a good portion of them are actually publicly owned companies. They're city-owned water and wastewater systems. They're city-owned um, air pollution control stuff that's going on. There are private, right, businesses as well that they regulate. They regulate some of the oil and gas industry on the emissions side of things. But air pollution is one of their big focuses, water pollution. So a lot of times, the people that are working in the agency used to work in, say, a city's water department, right? They were responsible for managing the water in that distribution system and ensuring that it was clean and drinkable water. Then they get hired by TCQ to be, right, an investigator that goes to make sure that those city water utilities are delivering clean and drinkable water, maybe even the same place that they used to work. So again, you can see how maybe there'd be some extraneous interests that would lead them to being focused on more than just what the public needs. Again, very complex. This agency had about 2,000 people working for it. And I want to say somewhere in the neighborhood of about 45 to 50% of this agency were credentialed individuals. In other words, they were licensed or mainly licensed, right? It was either professional engineers or water operators or plant operators or wastewater operators. And so they had to have done a lot of education and work to get where they were. And they were dealing, if you're trying to figure out air pollution distribution across part of the state of Texas, you've probably got a background in some kind of cartography. You've probably got some meteorology training. You definitely got some environmental scientist training, so science training. So a lot of these people, masters, PhDs, professional engineers, right? And so it's a very complex agency doing a lot of interesting work. And they even let people like me work for them. So when we look at these agencies, we look at these boards, we look at their commissions, Texas, and they do this much like any other state does, tries to set these organizations up so that when the governor appoints people to them, they're appointed to an organization that is effective in making decisions. So generally we set them up to work autonomously from the governor, right? The governor appoints people that have the same political philosophy and perspective, and then assumes they're going to manage that agency the way the governor would. And for most cases, that's true. But the agencies are designed, the boards and commissions are designed so that they can be a decision-making organization, which usually means that we have an odd number of people appointed to run these agencies, these boards and commissions. And that way, when they as a group vote to do something, there's going to be a decision made because you have an odd number making that decision. In Texas, we tend to focus on either 3-member or 9-member, sometimes 5, but usually 3 or 9-member commissions. These people are appointed by the governor. They serve 6 years, and they can be reappointed by the governor if everybody's on board with that. No limit to the number of terms they can serve. Most of them, especially if it's a volunteer position, serve 1 or 2 terms and that's it. Some of them that are appointed, right, they're full-time paid and they're looking to make a career out of it usually. We also usually set those up so that the governor is continually reappointing or appointing new people on a couple-year basis. So they're staggered so that you have some people there with experience as new people come on and then they transition across. So that's general design of the way we set them up, right? We build these boards with these members. Um, Regardless of the structure, whether it's 3 members, 5 members, 9 members, 1 appointed member, 15 elected members, whatever the case is, internally, we try to organize these agencies to be effective, to be efficient. Now you hear people all the time talk about, oh, they're bureaucrats, that's bureaucracy, that they're just wasting time, wasting money. There's a lot of red tape, they're not very efficient. And then you hear people make those accusations transition to the position of saying, we ought to design the government to work like a business, right? To be efficient like a business has to be efficient. I think that's really, really kind of silly that we hear that for 2 reasons. One, somewhere in the neighborhood of 85 to 90% of businesses fail within the first couple of years, which means they probably had some kind of problem in how they were being efficient and effective. But 2, when you look at how we organize an agency, we do design them to act like businesses. We do design them to operate efficiently and effectively wherever possible. And most of the time, you look at the internal structure of an organization, of a state agency, and it looks just like the internal structure of a private company. Meaning the thoughts that go into how to be efficient and effective and organize this thing are the same. Now we've got 3 theories about how this happens. We're going to talk first about the traditional bureaucratic design. This is for all state agencies in Texas. This is the basis of how we organize them. When the legislature passes legislation and say we're going to have a new agency, and it's going to look like this, this part, right, is this list here, right? Back in the 1800s, a guy named Max Weber, German, was trying to figure out the most effective and efficient organizational design to apply, right, to German government at the time. And what he decided was, really, if you find the most efficient organization out there, and it's what? Well, at the time he's doing it, it's the German military, right? The German military has always been effective and efficient, maybe misguided, but they've been effective and efficient. And so Weber's looking at this going, well, we should organize, right, to be effective and efficient. And the government, the German military is certainly that way. And he started looking at German businesses, and he found out that most of them had organized themselves in the same way the German army had. So this is what he wrote up. He says, look, the best way to organize the parts of government that are working with the people is to make sure that there is a hierarchical design, that there's an authority structure that people can see, understand, and is efficient. What that organization looks like, I'll just jump over real quick, is this, right? It's a pyramid design. If you look at the bottom part of an organization, that's where most of the people are. It's where the broadest cross section is. And those are the people that are engaging the public, right? Those are the ones that are doing customer service. Those are the ones, one up from that are solving problems for customer service. One up from that are the folks that are starting to manage and be experts about their subject matter and manage the people beneath them. And then you've got directors and an executive director, right? You've got these decision makers at the top. That is the normal design of businesses. It's the normal design of agencies. This hierarchical, right, having a hierarchy of authority that moves from concentrated authority at the top to a distributed authority through the center to the foot shoulders at the bottom that you tell them, here's what you got to do. Within that hierarchy, we build levels of specialization. So at the bottom, you got customer service reps. And think about your experience here. Let's say you're on the phone, you've got a computer problem of some kind. You're calling your manufacturer and you're telling them, hey, I've got this problem. And the person you're talking to is a customer service person. And they're like, okay, well, let's do some troubleshooting, blah, blah, blah. And they take you through a couple of steps and they say, oh, do you see this? Do you see that? What they're doing is they're going through a set of scripted procedures based upon what you told them about how they think to fix that. They've been, as customer service specialists, right, trained, specialized in being hopefully pleasant and helpful to the customers of a business. We do the same thing at a state agency, right? We have people whose job is to be on the front lines and interact with the public, and they're trained to, right, handle 95% of the problems that are brought to them that are, right, they can sit there and quickly explain them, hand them a piece of paperwork, right, work them through the process and get them moving on. So they've specialized in handling easy, quick, clear problems and getting most of the people taken care of right away. Second level are your second level customer service folks, or your tier 2 folks, right? They're the ones when you're on the phone and somebody's trying to help you, it's just not happening. You say, can we escalate this to a specialist or a supervisor, right? Because the layer above them is going to be people that have been through the customer service stuff probably and are now at the point of handling the one-off problems, handling the unique things that there's not a set of rules or a set of standard operating procedures to solve that you can give to an entry-level person. And their job is to sit there and figure it out. Above them is going to be their management, right? Who've come up probably through those same things and is now, right, managing the customer service people, managing these specialists, right, that are handling the difficult issues. And sometimes they'll get thrown back into the mix as well. We organize our agencies exactly the same way. And usually we promote people out of customer service that are really good at figuring out the internal workings of things, and then you're successful there, you end up getting promoted to management, right? That doesn't always work out real well, but it tends to be the practice, right? This hierarchical design is the norm. And it's how we in Texas set our agencies up, because we want them to be organized efficiently and effectively, just like businesses are, corporations are. And then to try to keep them working within that model, we design, right, rewards, merit, based upon how they work within the system, right? If they're always pleasant, they're getting good customer service responses, their solve rate is at the 95% level for problems, right? They handle whatever it is that's being brought to them. In most cases, their referral rate up to higher specialists is pretty low. That's the kind of things, objective things that we look at and we reward with hopefully better pay or time off or some kind of recognition, right? And we want to make sure that they're delivering that kind of service routinely to anyone and everyone that comes to their desk, right, to their window. So we're going to reward them based on how they do their work, how well they do their work, and we're going to reward them based on how they treat everybody, right? Because in government, right, these are all constituents, these are all citizens, right? how they treat them and solve their problems for them. It's how we design it, right? This model, this traditional bureaucratic design model, is what we use when we build a new agency, or even when we reorganize an agency. We're looking to this every time as a starting point, right? Of how we put it all together. From management at the top to customer service, forward-facing, people-facing people at the bottom. So this is how we in Texas design our agencies to work, and the idea being that they're going to be efficient when they're doing this, right? Effective. So this is the first of three models, right? But remember, this is the base. We're going to set it up based on these principles so it works this way. The next two models we're going to talk about are models that describe how agencies are working, what they're doing in real life, not how they were designed and then turned loose in the wild, but what they're doing in the wild, right? Okay, we know you were designed to work this way, but what are you doing? Are you working that way? Have you changed some? Are you doing something completely different? So we're going to talk about two theories here. We're going to talk about the acquisitive, monopolistic, bureaucratic model, and we're going to talk about the garbage can model. Both of these models are descriptive models. In other words, they're not theoretical in that we're going to put this together and put it out there and expect it to work. These are, here's an agency and I'm looking at how it works, and here's a description of how it's doing its work. So this is the rubber meets the road part, right? The first one here, this acquisitive monopolistic model, recognizes that when bureaucracies are created and they're doing their work, that the agency, the bureaucracy, is in a sense conscious of itself, right? The leadership, the management within it are saying, hey, we're here to do this work, provide this service, to be effective, get things done. But all of us that are in this organization, right, are working and getting paid. This is our career. So we want to be effective. We want to do good work for the people out there, but we also want to make sure, right, that we're going to be around for a while, that we're, right, being successful in our career. So we're going to be looking at things like, well, I'm a manager in this organization and we're taking care of this and we're doing pretty good. But if we could do this, we would be better. And so we're going to ask for more power. We're going to ask for more money. We're going to try to look after, as a secondary focus, right, the health of the organization. We're going to look out at the other industries. We're going to look out at the other agencies, and we're going to see, is there anything out there that threatens us? Anything out there that looks like it could replace us? And what we're going to do over time, right, is try to make sure that we're as effective and efficient as we can, so that there are no challenges to the money and the power and the job that we have. If we can make ourselves a monopoly, like the only one in the state government doing this, then we'll try that. Right? We'll aim for that, because at that point you're almost making yourself the term too big to fail, right? You're the only one doing something, and it's a critical task that needs to be done, and you're doing it. So you will try to do anything you can to ensure that your budget grows, to ensure that what you're doing, your responsibilities grow, because as those things happen, your power grows. And so we see through, right, witnessing these agencies do their work, that they actually are becoming more like a business than most of us would have even thought. right? You think, oh, well, but they're a state agency and they're just going to do what they're told and they get paid what they get paid and they're just going to move on. Well, no, they don't. I mean, they do. That part is true, but there's also right this idea of right not just doing your job, but protecting the organization that you're doing your job within. And so you'll find yourself as a state agency at times in competition with other state agencies. I'll give you an example. Texas Commission on Environmental Quality issues a lot of licenses to people to do work in Texas, mostly around water interest, irrigation, wastewater collection, water distribution, and then water services as far as cleaning and presenting good water, drinkable water to people. And that agency is responsible for licensing all those people to do that. But there's another group of people out there that work in drinking water as well. And these are the well drillers in Texas, right? People that go out and drill water wells in rural areas where there's not a city water system. They're licensed by the Texas Department of Licensing and Regulation, Texas Board of Licensing and Regulation, right? So TCQ has all these other water licenses, but that one is over there with that other agency. And all of the water scientists are at TCQ. TDLR just has people that process papers and issue licenses when all the tick boxes have been checked, right? But over here, we develop the curriculum, we develop the training, we develop the exams, we've got all the scientists, we've got all the educators, they're just over there handling paperwork. That's a perfect situation for the agencies to start becoming competitive with one another. And TCQ goes to the legislature and says, hey, a lot of complaints being made. People over there at TDLR don't really know what they're doing about well water drillers. We wrote all of that, right? Information about how they're supposed to do their job, right? We should be the ones that are vetting them and deciding whether they get a license or not them, right? So you actually get active competition between bureaucracies. Of course, TDLRs are there looking at it going like, hey, don't take our money and our people away. They're here, right? They belong to us. And TCQ is going, send those paper pushers over there, right, to us. Send that budget over here to us. We'll wrap them into our organization, train them up right, and get things going the way they need to. So there's this sense that these bureaucracies can become acquisitive, right? They're not just looking, right, to maintain themselves. They're looking to grow. They're looking to become as powerful as possible, right? And this is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is a split on their focus, right? They're supposed to be delivering service to the constituents of Texas, and most of the time they are, but they're also looking out for themselves. And this is the acquisitive monopolistic bureaucratic model. It says, right, this self-preservation perspective pervades the organization, and the organization is working, right, to further its own goals and its own power, and not just looking after the tasks that have been assigned to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
The last model of how descriptive model that we have of bureaucracy is called the garbage can model. And this is an interesting kind of perspective, and you see it right when you're in bureaucracy. You see it all the time. It's absolutely a true description of what happens. All organizations, if they're being successful, right, they're generally doing what they're supposed to do, tend to grow some, right? It may be through just inertia, right? It may be through some focused growth plan, but successful organizations tend to expand. And it's no different than for successful bureaucratic organizations. One of the things that's going on is that Agencies, as they do their work and as they figure out how to handle the problems and issues that pop up, they actually become fairly well organized. They become fairly well educated, and they develop specialists. They develop people that are experts in what they work on, right? Only at a place, right, like TCEQ, are you going to find people who've spent 20 years, right, developing exams for wastewater people in the state of Texas, right, that gets them a license. And so you'll have educators, right, that have worked their way up through that bureaucracy and through that agency, and they know every license that is out there, and what you have to know to get this license, and what you have to know to get that license, and where you need to spend more time studying to pass this test versus that test. And right, they're experts at what they do. What that also means, though, is that when they're looking out in the world, a lot of times their expertise identifies things that they could fix, identifies things that they understand, that they could put attention to and do good work with if they had the authority to. But they don't, right? It's not part of what their agency does. But you will see, right, agencies go to the legislature and say, look, I see you got a bill on this issue, and you're looking at putting this at this organization over here, but I've got specialists at my organization that can handle that problem. I know it's not what we're meant to be doing, right? But we're really good at it. We've got the people that can handle it, and this would be good for Texas, and it would be good for the agency, right? Because you're kind of diversifying your interest. You're becoming, right, spreading out your expertise, and you're kind of insulating your agency against some issues. And what's happening here is the agency that's developed this kind of technical expertise is now looking to solve problems that aren't their own, right? They're sticking their hand down into a garbage can of problems and pulling a problem up and looking at it and saying, yeah, we could fix that. And everybody else is looking and going, that's not your business. I'll give you an example. Again, experience provides my basis for talking about this. Commission on Environmental Quality. A few years ago, right, we had people we would call them field personnel. Their jobs to go out into the environment and do some research, do some observation, find problems, talk about what how they're supposed to solve those problems. And they came upon an interesting issue. There are thousands and thousands of water dams, right, in the state of Texas. Any ranch of a certain size is going to push up some reservoir, push up some watering holes, or tanks as we call them, right? We have Department of Agriculture, right, pushing up soil and conservation. I'm sorry, the Department of Agriculture? Maybe it's the Land Commission. Anyway, other agencies that push up soil and conservation reservoirs, right? And they do that by building a big earthen dam, right? And it captures water runoff and holds it in a reservoir, right? Keeps it from flooding somewhere else, right? We're redirecting floodwaters, especially in Texas, flash floodwaters, things like that. We build all these reservoirs to handle, right, the movement of water on the ground. And sometimes private individuals do it on their property, sometimes business interests do it, sometimes the state does it. But anyway, we found ourselves in a position of having literally thousands of dams in Texas. And most of them were completely unregulated. Now, libertarians going, and that's the way it ought to be, right? But here's the problem. Dams deteriorate over time. No one in the state of Texas had the regulatory authority or responsibility for managing the maintenance of these dams. Okay, that's a problem. Now, you're looking at a dam like Mansfield Dam or something that forms Lake Travis. That's big, that's obvious, that's right there. There's people looking at that, right? But not for a lot of the other ones that were out there that aren't those big, huge, right, concrete dams. We're talking earthen dams. And the thing that we found out real quick, right, is that people were, these researchers that were out in the field were going, look, there's a new city half a mile downstream of where this reservoir was built. And if that reservoir, if its earthen dam gives way, it's going to run 3 feet of water through that city fast, right? When's the last time anybody inspected that dam to see if it was still in good condition, to see if it needed some maintenance? When's the last time we generated a list, and we knew the answer to this, there wasn't one, of all of these dams, where they were, and if there's any populated areas that were going to be threatened by these dams if they fail? And so TCQ took that problem to the legislature, and they said, look, this is all over the place, right? We don't know. We've seen this, and we've got this feeling that this is a much bigger problem. But we also have the people that have the training. We have the engineers working for us already, that we could set up a program, a regulatory program for these dams, and ensure that they get inspected on a routine basis, that we come up with a process and procedure to do that inspection, and that we can keep these and their owners apprised of what needs to be done. And that's exactly what happened. And TCQ now finds itself in the business of managing and regulating dams in the state of Texas. Not anything that anybody anticipated. So they've grown because of their expertise and because of their recognition of a problem, and because that expertise they have allows them to solve that problem. Now, what that means is that if this is happening, and it is, with agencies across the state of Texas, right, what we see over time is these agencies become larger, distributed outside their original intent of the legislature, doing things they were never intended to do. And sometimes that's good, and sometimes it's not. It's questionable, and it's like, this doesn't make sense. And so essentially you see haphazard growth because they've identified these extraneous problems that have nothing to do with them, except that they are experts and recognize that that's a problem, right? And so agencies are, in a sense, out there with these specialists that have solutions to problems they haven't even found yet. And the bureaucracies grow because of that, right? And it's kind of interesting. But again, this model, the garbage can model, and the acquisitive monopolistic model are descriptive, right? These are here's what we're seeing in the real world, right? How these agencies are doing things and how they're growing and how they're addressing problems that no one anticipated, right? And so you go to an agency like TCQ and you say, hey, what do you do? And they say, well, we're basically the EPA of Texas, and so we're trying to make sure Texas's environment we've got clean air and clean water and clean land, and it's all healthy and good for us. And then somebody goes, well, what are you doing with those dams over there? And it's like, oh, okay. So, those things happen, and you get those kind of programs that just develop up, and then every now and then every now and then the legislature recognizes this haphazard growth and expansion, and they'll go in and carve bits and pieces off and put them in places that make more sense. Example of that was TCQ used to have a program called injection well regulation. And an injection well is a well that when you finish tapping a gas well or an oil well, you come back in and you inject stuff into that well to close it off and to keep, to make it somewhat inert and keep it from leaking and destroying the environment. And so at least there's a little bit of an environmental part to this, but it's really something that when you think about it should probably be under the railroad commission and their regulatory, because they're oil and gas folks, and they should be the ones that are keeping track of where these injection wells are and what they were capped with, what they were injected with, and how long they've been sitting there. Our job is really more of managing the environment around it to see if there's anything bad happening, not managing whether they got capped or not or the injection well was handled. So at one point the legislature was reviewing what was going on and said, we see where y'all got to sign this and you're doing a good job and that's all fine, but we think it makes more sense to move it over here. And so they picked up that whole program, took the money out of the budget, took the people that were assigned to it, all the data, and they moved all over to the railroad agency. Didn't change anything except where they were working. All of the other stuff stayed the same. It was a necessary, useful project, but they put it they reorganized it because TCQ had grown in this haphazard way, doing things that it wasn't really originally intended to do, and so they organized it and cleaned it up to try to get back to that original idea of these agencies being efficient and effective at what they're doing, which means keeping your eye on your subject area. Does that make sense? All right, we've got about 15 minutes or so left here, so I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about change of topic, but what we call sub-governments. And this is an interesting cross-section of everything we've kind of studied this semester. Sub-governments bring in elements of the legislature, elements of the bureaucracy, and elements of the public, the electorate, the interest groups, and even some of the political parties, all at one time. And that's the recognition of how these different bits and pieces of the political process and political players develop a relationship or an interdependency that is a prime component to how things get done. Right. So look at this one. I'm going to jump over and show you a figure image real quick. What happens when we're looking at the real world of ongoing legislation and interactivity between the public and government and then the bureaucracy that does things is that a relationship develops between interest group lobbyists and the public. The committees and or subcommittees, that are the subject areas that the legislation is going to be heard in. So to stay with our environmental thing, you've got lobbyists that are out there working for businesses and environmental interest, and they're going to engage with the legislators that work on natural resources committee as they're working legislation through their committee that has to deal with that subject. And of course, we talked about that the agency is out there filing fiscal notes on the bills as they get put in there and saying, hey, if you pass this like this is what we're going to have to do. Here's how much it'll cost. Here's how long it'll take. And so what you have is continued interaction between the same folks coming out of the public, the same legislators in government, and the same bureaucrats in their bureaucratic agencies, because we're all focused on the same subject area. And so what develops is the thing we call a sub-government. And a sub-government is these three elements, coming together in a microcosm, and in that is the democratic process. So the people that show up at the committee hearings, the people that show up to talk to legislators, they have communication, from here on this screen just indicated as a lobbyist, but they have their communication going to the legislature, members of the legislature. Members of the legislature are in communication back and forth with the state agencies that are going to regulate the law once it's put into place. And there's even communication going between the agency and the lobbyists, because as the agencies start to figure out how they're going to do this business and put this law into effect, the lobbyists or people from the public are there saying, we would really like you to see you do it this way instead of this way because it costs us less, or it lets us do this which makes more money, or if we can manage this kind of oversight but not that. And so you've got this two-way communication going between all of the players and that are going to be involved in a single piece of legislation, generally in a subject area of legislation. And they develop relationships. They know each other by name, right? I used to have, right, a set of associations in Texas, right, where the executive director of those interest groups, the lobbying element of those interest groups, right, we were on first name basis with me and the agency and them and the interest group, and we'd call each other up and say, hey, did you see this bill yet that's coming this way, and here's what we're looking at, and what do you think about, right? And it's not an internal kind of, hey, let's get together and see what we can do that nobody knows about. It's just I know you're going to be talking to me at some point about this. I know I'm going to be working with the staff from this legislator that proposed the bill at some point. They know they're going to be working with me, and we're just reaching out to the people we know because of history and experience that we're going to have to work with and talk to as we move through this process. And that's just a normal evolution of business, right? And in this case, it's right, the legislative business, but it's business. And so, right, these people, you could run into them right at a restaurant and you'd recognize them and say, hey, right? One of the guys that I worked with quite often had the same first name as me, right? So we always were, hey Russell, and it's, and so, we knew each other, and you go to conferences, you go to, get-togethers with organizations, right? You might go have meals together or drinks, you're hanging out, you're talking, you've got a shared experience that gives you something to talk about and something to visit about. And it's the same with the legislators and the lobbyists and the public that shows up on a routine basis as it is with the bureaucrats. And so you've got this little sub-government, right, that's doing all of the democratic work, right, of people telling you this is what we want and this is a problem, and legislature, can't you fix that? And agency working in there's, yes, we can do this way if that's the way you set up the law. And it's all at a very small micro level, right? And this happens with every piece of legislation, right, that goes through the legislature. So you're looking at the same repetitive kind of interaction time again. Relationships develop. Well, there is nothing in the world wrong with the sub-government. That's a good thing, right? It's an efficient, effective process. All the people that need to talk to one another are working together and talking to one another. And that's great. When that's working that way, these three groups are working together, things are getting done, problems are being solved, policies being made. And that's a sub-government, right? That's what we're talking about back here. That's where you get these strong ties between these three elements of the process, and that kind of is where the democracy happens. And that's great. The problem happens, though, that occurs out of this quite often, is that as with any kind of interaction between people, if you do it often enough with the same people, you tend to think of that group as the only ones that are interested in doing the work, the only ones that are going to be impacted, the only ones that are going to show up. And so you, right, kind of insulate yourself. You start thinking of, oh, we got a water quality issue. I need to call this person, that person, or they're calling you, and that's it. and that runs the risk of excluding others because they're not part of the clique. They're not part of the group that's always there. And when that happens, you start actively saying, well, I don't know who you are, why you think you need to be involved, but this is between me and that legislature and that lobbyist over there. And so, you can just back on out of this conversation. When you get to that, when that kind of situation develops, which is kind of human nature, I think, because you get comfortable with what you know, and then someone new comes along, and you're like, eh. We call that an iron triangle. Right? Iron triangles are not good things. Iron triangles are, right, who you know, who you like, who you worked with, and then an exclusion of new folks that are coming in that want to be involved in the process. And if this is a working democracy, the door's supposed to be open, right? Those others that come along later or come along with different ideas and concerns, door's supposed to be open to them. Communication is supposed to happen with them too. And sometimes it doesn't because it's, you get used to what you're working with. Maybe you don't know that you've closed the door. You're not conscious of excluding them, but you have, right? Because they're trying to figure out who to talk to. And if you were paying attention, you'd reach out to them and say, the discussion's over here, get involved. And you don't. And sometimes they get left out. It's a good phrase, right? I mean, this is really just a recognition of what happens in high school, right? In high school, you get your little clique of friends, right? There's thousands of you there, but you end up hanging out with the same 5 or 6 people, right? Or 10 people if you've got an extended group in, right? Hollywood, it's everywhere, right? It's just human nature. And there's not anything necessarily malicious about it as it forms and as it happens, but the results of it can be bad, right? And people can feel like they've been excluded and they got left out. And there's all the popular kids over there, and I'm over here trying to figure out why I can't be part of it. And the popular kids over there, maybe there's some active, we're a group and we don't want to be, but maybe it's just, here's who we hang out with, and we always do this, and we didn't know you wanted to join. Who knows, right? But the idea is that when that communication is not open and other groups can't come in, we call that an iron triangle. And once a subgovernment transitions from open and energetic and conversational to closed dialogue of a few people, it loses its democracy, right? The whole democratic notion of it now being an idea of a small form of government working in a democratic fashion is gone. And so that becomes a bad thing at that point. So we're at the end of time, so we'll call slide 14 for be the end of today. We'll pick up with a little different take on this idea when we come back on Thursday. Any questions?